Well, where are we today, Bill?
Well, today, Rick, we are in Kingston, New Hampshire.
Kingston.
Get that right. Kingston,
Yep.
New Hampshire. And we are in the Greenwood Cemetery.
Okay.
And we are here to visit a rather famous couple, New Hampshireites. This is Barney Hill and Betty Hill.
Okay, yep.
And as it says underneath their names on their stones, of the interrupted journey. And anyone who is a fan of UFOs or a believer in UFOs will certainly recognize the story of Betty and Barney Hill.
I think it is one of the most famous stories, isn't it?
It is, and it was one of the first stories, and it was the first story of a documented close encounter, if you will.
Of the third kind.
Yes,
right?
as they claimed to be abducted by aliens.
Yep.
Extraterrestrials, if you will.
Wait.
It's a fascinating story. They were on kind of a second honeymoon or a romantic trip to Canada. They went to Montreal and Quebec. And on their way home, they came through New Hampshire, down through the White Mountains. And they were just about to Cannon Mountain, where the old man of the mountain stood.
Yep.
And suddenly they realized that there was a light in the sky, and they actually saw the object pass over the old man of the mountain, which must have been quite interesting, quite a romantic picture if you think about it.
Yeah.
In any event, the light seemed to get closer and closer, and they suddenly discovered that they were being followed. And they had their little dog with them, whose name was Delsey. It's Delsey. I hope I pronounced that right.
Yeah,
Delsey.
sounds good to me.
Yeah. Anyway, like all dogs on a long trip, the dog needed to be relieved. And so they stopped, and at which point the light was right in front of them. And they looked, and suddenly the road was actually blocked by the alien craft. And here's where it gets interesting, because they continued on their way home to Port. They lived in Portsmouth, and they were on their way home, and they continued on the way. Well, when they arrived at Portsmouth, they had no recollection of why it took. It was like 6 hours, what should have been a 4-hour
drive. Yeah.
They just had no recollection whatsoever. It happened to them, and then both of them starting to have reoccurring dreams.
Yeah, I heard about that.
About the abduction.
Yeah.
And eventually, they actually reported the incident to the Air Force, because they're very close to Pease Air Force Base. And they reported it, and they were interviewed for the Operation Blue Book.
Yeah.
And they took them serious. And but what happened was they had these reoccurring dreams, and they couldn't really account for that lost time, hence the interrupted journey. And someone suggested that they go under hypnosis.
Yeah.
And they did. And amazingly enough, they did under hypnosis recall the story in great detail. And their stories were almost identical. There were some differences, but very few. And they remembered being on the ship. They remembered being probed. They did medical exams on them. And they remembered this in great detail, including Betty was shown a map of the stars, and she drew it from memory. And later on, of course, the story was that nobody knew what it reflected at the time. But later on, with newer discoveries, they found that the match was almost identical to another solar system that we now know about.
Right.
So, and this is of conjecture, of course, but.
Well, I think I read that also the way that the map showed this planet that they apparently were trying to say they were from, it was the perspective would have been different, because it was done, from a different, not from Earth.
Yes.
But from another, so obviously it would look different.
Right. The sun was in the wrong place, as I understand it, because they were looking at it from a different perspective.
Exactly.
So, what after these interviews, the hypnosis, they got discovered.
Yes.
Up until this point, neither one of them made any attempt to get any publicity about this. They didn't, seek the public eye at all. And then, lo and behold, these tapes got released to a reporter from the Boston Traveler. And he did a front page story in the Boston paper, in the Traveler, about the incident. And then the story was seized upon the famous John Fuller, who wrote numerous different stories about aliens and space travel, etc. And he called it, the name of the book was The Interrupted Journey.
Yep, very appropriate.
Yep, it was a great name, and it was a huge success. I think it's obviously still in print, probably, but it's been in several printings, and this occurred in 1966.
Yep.
And when the book came out.
Yep.
And it was a huge success. And I remember I was a freshman in college at the time, and it was very popular among students in my dorm. Thought this was pretty amazing because I was in school in New Hampshire and we weren't that far away. And it was, a very interesting story.
Actually, to tell you the truth, I think I read that way back when.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
I read of interest there.
Yeah.
Especially because they were from New Hampshire.
Yes.
So it was,
and then shortly thereafter, the famous incident in Exeter occurred. That was a year or so after that. The actual date was the night of September 19th and 20th, 1961.
Yeah.
And we are standing here on September 9th, 2024. So it was 63 years ago, almost to the date that this happened. And both Rick and I know the White Mountains of New Hampshire and traveled Route 3 numerous times, been through there at night, and coming down through the notch there can be quite spooky.
Yeah, and I think, it's hard to drive by there in that general area. And there is a marker there, state marker, that says this is more or less where it happened. But you drive down through there, and at least I have since we started looking into this for our book. But my feeling is like, oh, wow, what did that look like? Driving down through there.
Well, there's a big difference now. It's actually a 4-lane highway, but as anybody who's ever traveled it recently knows that it narrows right down and goes, very narrow notch, and it's all downhill, and you can, Cannon Mountain is up on your right if you're going south. And of course, the Old Man of Mountain, who is gone now, occurred as you got past Cannon Mountain. You could see it from the road. And back then, it was just a 2-lane highway. And today, of course, it's 4 lanes, but it's still very narrow. But then it was just a 2-lane highway. And they were, at that time of night, they were the only people on the road.
I've had that experience. Interesting, though, you bring up a canon, because I remember reading a part of a section somewhere that one of the people who don't believe, somebody that doesn't believe all of this, or feels maybe that they were mistaken, is a better way to put it, is that there is apparently a beacon on Cannon Mountain that resembles what they describe.
Yes.
But
they noted, I believe, that the restaurant was lit up. The restaurant at the top of the ski mountain, Cannon Mountain, and they mentioned it, and then the lights went out. So, I don't know.
I don't know. Well, it's certainly one of those things that it's hard to prove really one way or another. I think personally, though, it's really interesting that they didn't seem to want to promote it at the beginning. I mean, it wasn't like they came back and said, "Oh, this is a great way to make some money."
Yes.
They didn't seem to have that kind of motivation.
No.
And I think Barney in particular even resisted, especially at the beginning, wanting to have any of this out.
It's really important to note, too, that Barney in particular, they were a mixed race couple.
That's correct, yeah.
And he was a black man. And he was very prominent in New Hampshire civil rights work. And that was, of course, in the early 60s, the civil rights era, the protests, and et cetera. And he was very active, and he didn't want this to show any reflection upon him being an honorable, honest man, which he was.
Yeah,
there was no question he was, and Betty too.
Yeah, no, she was a social worker.
Yes, yeah. So they were both well educated.
Yeah,
and he worked for the post department and postal department, and they both had were respected in their community, and it's interesting to note that the University of New Hampshire has their papers, and most unusual of all, Betty was wearing a blue dress the night of the abduction, and it was kind of torn up. There were rips in it. I've seen photographs in it. The hem was ripped. There's all kinds of damage done to it. Apparently, and that she had no recollection of how she certainly would not have ruined a good dress. So just to point out the story. But yes, if you can, I guess you can view this at the library in their historical collection at the University of New Hampshire. You can view Betty's dress that she was wearing the night of the abduction.
Well, very definitely an interesting story that carries on to this day. I think it was only a week or two ago that the whole group of people that celebrate UFOs and so on in New Hampshire did that.
Yeah, well, that's the Alien Festival in
the
Exeter.
Alien Festival, yeah,
which I have attended with my grandson a couple of times. It's a wonderful festival if you've never been, and young kids like he was then, very young, he enjoyed it immensely, and there was a lot of activities for children, and kind of a playful thing. But then guest speakers come, and there's a more serious side for those that are interested in alien abductions and that sort of thing. So it's actually quite a conference. And Betty actually, Barney, as you can see, died in 1969. He died shortly after the incident. And Betty died in 2004. And for a long time, she didn't really profit, but she attended a lot of these conferences, and she freely spoke about it. And whereas in the beginning they were rather reluctant about it.
Apparently,
she did. So,
well, I hope they are resting in peace.
Yes.
Very definitely an interesting story.
Yeah, I think they were, a very, very, warm people you would have probably wanted to meet and enjoyed talking to them too. I really get that feeling about them. So, yes, I hope they're resting in peace and they're free from abductions.
Let's hope so.